Our speaker today is Valerie Lewis. Valerie's been here before. She was born in the UK and taught in Ghana, Switzerland, Argentina, and Japan before marrying and arriving in Chicago. She taught English as a second language to adults for 20 years. She's truly a worldly individual. Please help me welcome Valerie Lewis.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come back. I'm happy to be here. So last year I talked, as Bob said, about my travels in Africa from west to east. And now I'd like to talk about how in 1968, I flew to Argentina with 3 British teachers to work in a private girls' school in Buenos Aires for 2 years. Wait a minute, I've got to get organized here. Sorry. So we have the map here, which I will be referring to from time to time to show our different places that we went. And in Argentina, I was in Buenos Aires, which is a very large, sophisticated city of 15 million. But outside, there are vast areas of grassland, pampas, and the whole of Patagonia, where you can still see gauchos who herd cattle. I saw natural wonders while I was all around South America, former civilizations, cities built by the Portuguese and the Spanish in the 15th and 16th centuries, and colorful towns throughout the Andes Mountains. And here I want to describe some of these and our journeys by land and water to get to them. So first of all, I hope you can see, oh, I don't have a pointer, do I? We went from Buenos Aires up to near Paraguay, the border of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, to the Iguazu Falls. These are magnificent. Spread over 1.5 miles in a huge horseshoe, 275 falls cascade among luscious tropical forests filled with butterflies, toucans, raccoon-like coatis, and other wildlife. They are breathtakingly beautiful. Eleanor Roosevelt, on seeing Iguazu, said, "My poor Niagara." From the falls, we crossed into Paraguay and were soon in Asunción, the capital. The Jesuits, who arrived in the country in the 1600s, founded communities where the indigenous people built strikingly beautiful churches. Jaguarón, the finest, while simple on the outside, is a riot of painted wood on the inside with brightly colored green, yellow, and red stripes winding up the pillars and going to archways above, and then a wonderful decorated ceiling. And then there is this amazing altar, which we saw many times in many churches around the continent. We took a bus for 250 miles through the Chaco, which is a vast, flat, hot, and dusty area where Paraguay and Bolivia fought a terrible war in the 1930s in which 100,000 men died. We passed colorful we went through this is what it looks like, the charcoal, everywhere. We passed colorful cowboys who wore very thick and wide chaps to protect themselves from dangerous thorny bushes, and very thick leather boots because there are large numbers of large snakes. Many birds, such as rheas, which are like ostriches, cranes and parrots could be seen among the trees, where mammals like this peccary also roam. Our destination was the town of Philadelphia, spelt with F's, where Russian members of the Mennonite sect, who had settled there after fleeing Stalin, were followed by German Mennonites escaping from East Germany after World War II. We found girls with long blonde braids speaking German, and most people were on horseback or in buggies, which they tied up to the hitching rails outside the bakery or the dairy. The town manufactured groundnut and cottonseed oils. Returning the next day to Asuncion, the roof of our bus had caged parakeets and cardinals, a sheep, several cowboy saddles, and other possessions all wrapped in flour sacks, which seems to me a good alternative to plastic. The inside of the bus was crammed with human passengers, along with chickens and ducks under the seat. So then the next part we did was we went into Uruguay and then to the vibrancy of Brazil, where the streets seemed perpetually full of people of every skin color and ethnic group. We tried not to get lost in vast Sao Paulo. Where are the hills? We were dazzled by the energy of Rio de Janeiro, with its mountains, beaches, such as Ipanema, cafes, and music. Further on, we went to the small, picturesque mining town of Ouro Preto, which became rich in the 1700s because it produced gold, diamonds, amethysts, and other gemstones. Consequently, its very wealthy inhabitants built 17 astonishingly lavish Baroque churches, in which pink ceilings were adorned with large numbers of cherubs and roses. In the nearby town of Mariana, we found in the church choir stalls paintings of elephants, dromedaries, leopards, men with parasols, and images from the willow pattern. How on earth did that happen? The Portuguese colonized Goa in India and Macau in China, and then when they came to Brazil, painted what they had seen in the East. I vividly remember being in the space age capital of Brasilia when the newspapers announced the first moon landing. It seemed very appropriate. This is the Congress in Brasilia, and on the right you have the House of Representatives, on the left the Senate, and then in the middle the administrative building. When we arrived in the city of Salvador on the northeast coast, I was reminded of West Africa by the music, the food stalls on the streets selling African dishes such as fried plantain, and the styles of women's dresses. And here's another one. The Portuguese imported more slaves than any other country in the Americas, mostly to work on sugar plantations. Some of the descendants of those slaves still follow the religion of Candomblé, which is a mix of Roman Catholicism and African deities. Some also still practice the martial art of capoeira, which is similar to karate and was deployed by the slaves as a martial art, but could be swiftly changed to dance movements when an overseer appeared. Having seen memorable places in most of the eastern parts of South America, when the long summer vacation came around, I set out with 3 of my colleagues, determined to travel through as much of the western part of the continent as possible. So we left Buenos Aires in a comfortable bus, which served coffee, snacks, and the occasional scotch on the rocks. But this was misleading. Our next vehicle was much older and packed with people. Then another bus took us ever higher. So this is the kind of bus, all right? I mean, it may have a Mercedes sign on the front, but it was from the 1950s already, and this is the late 1960s. So we traveled in that kind of bus. And on the bus were women dressed like this, and all of them with babies on their backs. And I sketched one woman also like that. And they had they had braids, pork pie hats, thick stockings, jackets, and shawls, and each had a baby on her back. All that clothing was because we were moving to altitudes where the midday sun in the rarefied air was hot, but the nights were bitterly cold. Quite a few people vomited as the bus twisted and turned on the narrow mountain roads, and men who were eating plums spat the pits on the floor. When we were pulling into Potosí in Bolivia, the lights of the mines inside Cerro Rico, this is meaning the rich mountain, were lit up. It's 15,000 feet high and towers over the city and has produced vast quantities of silver for centuries, significantly changing the world economy in the 1600s and leading Potosí to be considered at that time the world's largest industrial complex. Here's a picture someone drew and sent back to Spain, showing the mountain with all the parts of the silver inside. By the following century, 160,000 colonists had settled there, building handsome colonial-style houses and 32 churches. There's some more modern-day silver miners. This was somebody I sketched. There were many very poor people wandering around in the streets. And this man who was hoping he would be given a job as a porter, and he's holding his straps for carrying huge burdens on his back up the steep cobblestone streets. I suppose a lot of vans couldn't do that. So Potosi is an attractive town to walk around if you're not bothered by its altitude of 13,000 feet. So the Spanish discovered unbelievable amounts of silver in Bolivia. They also found the Indians in Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia possessed extraordinary amounts of gold, literally tons of it, thus creating the legend of El Dorado. Just as an example, a Spanish explorer in 1533 who followed the Magdalena River in Colombia inland returned with a solid gold figure of a porcupine weighing 132 pounds. The Indians decorated their bodies with gold, even wearing it as armor. They used it for religious purposes. They had discs of it hanging outside their homes, just like we have wind chimes, because they loved the way it shone in the sun. They even had bowls, spoons, fish hooks, and tweezers made of it because it had no monetary value for them. The Spanish took all the gold, often torturing the Indians to find out where it was hidden. So where did all the gold and silver go? Wait a minute, I meant to have this. If you look up at the far north of here, where it was carried by donkey and by ship to Cartagena, the heavily fortified town the Spanish built on the coast of Colombia, but on the side of the Caribbean, not the Pacific, which meant that they then had easy access to Spain. It's north of Panama, as you can, I hope you can see there. So it could be shipped, but it had to be guarded very carefully. No wonder Cartagena was vulnerable to frequent attacks by pirates from the Caribbean and endured numerous assaults and sieges. When the famous English sailor Sir Francis Drake attacked the city, he burned 200 houses and the cathedral. In the 1630s, massive protective walls were built, later followed by more fortifications, making the city virtually impregnable. At night, a chain was drawn across the entrance to the harbor. The efforts the Spanish took to protect their Fort Knox are phenomenal to see. So now we're going back to Bolivia. That was a little side information. As we traveled north in Bolivia, one part of our journey, we went through these kind of valleys, many, many valleys, and up mountains and down. We traveled in what you might call an autoferro, which means a bus on the railroad lines. This was nice and smooth compared with the buses we'd been on. And we admired the striking scenery in valleys. Oops, no. And the gorges above us were great big slabs of rock and desperate attempts by poverty-stricken villagers to grow food on steep, dangerous-looking terraces. Then the valleys became more prosperous looking, with haciendas surrounded by palm trees and eucalyptus. Thus we arrived in La Paz, which is the capital, the commercial capital of Bolivia, and at 11,000 feet, the highest capital in the world. Now, if you travel to the east from La Paz, you descend rapidly into rainforests where rivers drain eventually into the Amazon. However, if you leave La Paz as we did, and you go west and north, you are on the Altiplano. Oh, sorry, these are ladies in La Paz. I left the ladies, I forgot about them. Very typical costume. So we went north and west on the Altiplano, where high bare plains are bordered by snow-capped Andean mountains. Yet some miles further on, there are villages beside Lake Titicaca, which at 12,000 feet is the highest navigable lake in the world. It's a stunning setting with the spiritual aura, which has spawned many religious sites whose ruins, such as these at Tiwanaku, can be seen on the plains and on the islands of the lake. The border of with Peru and Bolivia runs right through the center of the lake. So we crossed by boat and then wound our way down to the Pacific, where our bus bounced beside the ocean through the desert, where the remains of many previous cultures are preserved in the dry air. In Lima, which is today's capital, and from where the Spanish viceroyalty controlled all of its territories in South America, picturesque colonial buildings like these, with interior courtyards, lie on streets with many churches and other 16th century buildings you might also find in Spain. We flew from Lima. I hope you can see this. Can you see? We flew from Lima up to Iquitos in the northern part of Peru. And we flew there because Iquitos is accessible only by air or water. While it's a mere 400 miles from the Andes to the west, it is 4,000 miles from the Atlantic Ocean to the east, and is the farthest up the river an ocean-going vessel can go. It was part of the rubber boom in the 1800s. Most of the houses along the river are thatched and on stilts, with hammocks suspended on the porch. The boat we found to go down the river for 2 days, the river meaning the main Amazon, was smaller than we expected, packed with people, including the captain's 10 children, and loaded with large sacks of onions. In the evening, everyone except us strung up their hammocks, reducing the space even more. I slept on the deck after very briefly trying out the pile of onion sacks. While moving on the river, it was fairly cool. This is the main Amazon River. I say main because there are dozens, if not hundreds, of tributaries. Wait a minute, so going down the river was cool and mosquito-free, but stops by the banks for the police and customs checks and to pick up some fruit were almost unbearable when the bugs found us. In the river, you can see parts of trees and branches floating, which have come down from heavy rains in the tributaries. And you can see some people in a canoe with an outboard engine. And then there are lots of villages along the shores. After this 2-day trip, we disembarked at the town of Leticia on the border inside Colombia and took to the air again in order to leave the forest, a bright green carpet below us. In Bogota, the capital of Bolivia, the highlight was the sensational gold museum, filled with unimaginable amounts of gold used by the Indians, as is said before, in every conceivable way, and similar, it seems to me, to the way we use plastic today. So gold, lovely statues. This is a nose ring, and the top of it goes in your nostril, and then this hangs down very low over your breast. And I drew this little knife. It's for religious reasons. They have these in their ceremonies, but it's solid gold. Since we were traveling through the Andes in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru by bus, a description of such buses in the 1960s seems in order. While I did travel in some so-called superior express buses, the majority would be in the class of battered and well past their prime. Their greatest failing was that they announced their departure time and never adhered to it. We spent many hours waiting for buses which left 2 or even 3 hours after their advertised departure. Sometimes the driver would gather a handful of customers in his bus, then drive around town while calling out through the window to would-be passengers on the street that this was their last chance before we were about to leave. Other times, a driver would have a bus full of passengers and, flush with our money, then take us all to the gas station to fill up with gas and check on the oil or tinker with the engine. Once on the road, a driver would have to make up for the late start, so we would drive for many, many hours without stopping. Punctures were part of the deal. These would draw our attention to the fact that the tire treads were barely visible. Thus, when buses went up and down mountains on narrow roads with hairpin bends and then had to back up for a herd of llamas coming the other way, the tire quality seemed of some importance. I once looked out to see our rear wheel balanced on one small stone, and beyond that, a drop of about 1,000 feet. We lurched over many riverbeds, one requiring all the passengers to walk through mud to get across. But riverbeds were useful to a bus which had a leaking radiator and needed frequent refills. Those stops also provided an opportunity for the driver to take a hammer and whack the part under the bus, which had a dreadful clank. And then there was the bus that kept backfiring until it blew the cap off the gas tank and flames were lighting the darkness outside. We scrambled out fast because there was no emergency exit and the windows were stuck. After the flames were extinguished, we shakily returned to the bus, which continued to backfire all through the night, along with our adrenaline. Now, Cusco, the capital of the great Inca Empire, together with the ruins of Machu Picchu, where the last Inca leaders fled from the Spanish, are unforgettable sights in South America. Oh, wait a minute. There. Traveling there took 7 days from Lima. On the map, it's just a small bit down near the bottom of the map. And I think as the crow flies, it's about 450 miles, but it took us 7 days. First by a train that climbed up to 15,000 feet, while a man in a white coat came through the train offering oxygen. Then there were many buses and many punctures. There were many narrow roads with hairpin bends up and down many mountains, but all going through spectacular scenery. So beautiful valleys with lots of trees, and then these bare mountainsides. We stayed in several rundown hotels in impoverished towns, which were ripe for the Marxist propaganda which overwhelmed them just a few years later and brought Peru close to revolution. But at last, Cusco appeared with its red-tiled roofs around interior courtyards, its fine plazas, and many buildings with Inca walls. Now, the Inca people rose to power in the 1200s, and by the time Francisco Pizarro arrived to torment them in 1526, the empire of 10 million people stretched from southern Colombia to northern Chile, a distance of 3,400 miles. The Inca civilization had no wheels, no large draft animals, no knowledge of iron or steel, and no system of writing. Yet the empire ran efficiently. A network of cobblestone roads enabled runners to connect all parts of the empire and even deliver freshly caught fish from the Pacific to Cusco. Records were kept with a complex system of knots on strings. Agriculture in the very diverse climate zones was tracked and accounted for. While there was no money in the exchange of goods and services, that was organized through a barter system. Taxes were in the form of a labor obligation to the empire. Some historians today say this was the first communist society. And then there's the architecture here in the picture. In Cusco, the famous Inca walls are made of large blocks of stone, which, like jigsaw pieces, fit so perfectly together you can't often slide a knife between them. Yet, in spite of having no mortar, they have withstood many earthquakes. The Church of Santo Domingo is built on top of Inca walls. Even the cinema had a facade of Inca stones. Then above, oh, and those are two inhabitants of Machu Picchu, Cusco. Now, above Cusco is this massive fort called Sacsayhuaman. And it has stones with rounded corners dovetailing together like this, but on a different order of magnitude. This one in a drawing with a man standing here, this stone behind him weighs 20,000 tons. You find yourself asking similar questions to those when you see the Egyptian pyramids or Stonehenge, namely, how on earth were the stones transported and then raised? Francisco Pizarro reached Peru in 1526 with 160 men, 1 cannon, and 27 horses. The soldiers all wore armor and had swords and lances. The Inca people had never seen horses. When Atahualpa, the ruler of the Inca Empire, refused to accept Christianity and the rule of King Charles I of Spain, Pizarro took him prisoner and demanded that Atahualpa provide him with gold. The Inca offered to fill with gold the room he was in, which measured 22 feet by 17 and 8 feet high, large room, and to follow that with twice as much silver in the same space. The promise was fulfilled, and then Pizarro executed him. The Inca nobility fled to several fortified sites in the mountains along the Inca highway. The last Inca ruler was executed by the Spanish in 1572, but the sanctuary of Machu Picchu was not found until 1911, when the archaeologist Hiram Bingham uncovered it. Machu Picchu, a mystical place. It's wonderful. Among the towering green mountains, many covered in cloud, sits on a saddle high above the Urubamba River, which roars through narrow gorges and the dense rainforest far below. When the thick vegetation was cleared in the 20th century, a nearly intact small town that might have supported 750 people was revealed. Many of the buildings in the picture would have had thatched roofs on them. The buildings, so some of the buildings housed the nobility, other buildings housed the people who worked there, and there were also plazas. This rounded building is thought of as a temple, a religious place, and there were terraces for providing food, which were irrigated by an aqueduct system. This town was abandoned in the 1600s, and the reason is a mystery. Now our summer Germany was coming to an end, and the new school year was beginning. Having spent many weeks in the Andes Mountains, we got on yet another bus and traveled, well, by several buses, into Chile, to Santiago, the capital, before heading southward to the edge of Patagonia. There we passed 2 volcanoes, Mount Osorno, a picture-perfect triangular mountain with snow on its peak, and nearby Mount Tronador, which has 8 very large glaciers. A series of boats took us through lakes with scenery reminiscent of Switzerland to Bariloche in Argentina. From Bariloche, we rode a train rather than our usual bus because a vast network of railroads was built in the early 1900s in Argentina to transport wool from Patagonia and refrigerated meat from the grassy pampas. So for 2 days, we looked at sheep, cattle, horses, soybeans, and sunflowers before safely and gratefully pulling into Constitucion Station in Buenos Aires. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions.
Walk around with the microphone, raise your hand if you have a question.
Did you bring how many souvenirs other than pictures?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Souvenirs, did you bring how many gold or silver or any other souvenirs?
Not gold or silver, no. But I have ponchos and shawls. In Argentina, they have a lot of alligators. So I have an alligator purse and a lot of things like that. Yeah.
Valerie, you did this trip 60 some odd years ago.
Yes.
Have you been back?
Yes.
And
Michael and I went back once, and I've been back twice.
how recently?
Not recently. The last time was maybe 20 years ago.
Had it changed dramatically from the time
It
you done
changed,
this?
yes, yes. And
Yeah.
when I look at pictures now of the cities, I hardly recognize them because they've all got great big skyscrapers and here we traveled on buses everywhere. And now I see in a lot of cities, they've got subways and very fancy buses and trains, and that none of that existed.
One statistic that I have heard over the years, and you could perhaps corroborate this for me, that Brazil is larger than the United States.
It may be. It's a vast.
It's hard to conjure something
It's
like that up.
huge. It's huge. It's a wonderful country. Yes,
Well, yeah, of course.
yes,
country,
like
yeah.
Alaska.
Yeah.
Right,
Thank you.
yes.
I have the fortunate family history of marrying my wife, whose father was born in Paraguay. And recently we went back, and I also had taught in Sao Paulo. When I was there in 78, I went to Iguazu Falls, and all they had were planks going over the falls. We went back about 5 years ago, and I think OSHA was there, and they supplied handrails to the planks. But I would agree with you, if you ever have the chance, go see Iguazu Falls.
Yes, they're beautiful. Yes.
This isn't a question as much as it is a comment related to change. I have a master's degree in Latin American studies.
Oh.
And my master's thesis was on the encroachment of civilization on primitive cultures of the Amazon of Brazil. And most of those cultures I studied in 1978 have disappeared. And so I really believe, this is a comment. I really believe that the Amazon, that whole area, should not belong to any country. I think it's because the oxygen that the Amazon rainforest gives out is 25% of oxygen that we breathe. And I really believe that the Brazilian government is being very, what do I want to say? They're being not inconsiderate. They're being obstinate and dictatorial in trying to quote unquote develop the Amazon. And for that reason alone, I don't think that the Amazon should belong to Brazil. I don't think it should belong to any country. I think it should be managed by the
Right,
by the United Nations or some other governmental agency like that, international governmental agency. There you have it. And that's all I have to say about that. But your talk was very good. It was very interesting.
thank you.
Since I was about 8 years old, I read about Ecuador, and I would like to know your experience of what the climate was like when you were actually in Ecuador.
Oh, yes, I didn't really speak much about Ecuador. The capital called Quito is a beautiful place high up in the mountains with beautiful mountains all the way around. A lovely place, but the western side of Ecuador goes steeply down through hundreds of miles of banana plantations. Many of the bananas you eat come from Ecuador, to Guayaquil, which is the big port on the ocean. And I just happened to see in a newspaper article the other day that Ecuador right now has huge political problems, and Guayaquil, which was a bad place even when we went there in 1969, in that one of us had our watch ripped off her wrist, and we had to walk around in 80 degrees with coats and everything to cover up anything we had underneath and hide our passports and so on. That was in 1968. Now, apparently, it's awful and ruled by gangs. So I think Ecuador, in spite of being just a lovely, lovely country, now is faced with awful problems. But you asked about the weather. So the weather high up in Quito is beautiful. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure how high Quito is, but let's say about 8,000 feet. And then, but Guayaquil was awful. It's down right on the coast and it was hot and steamy and not good. So I don't know which part of Ecuador you're talking about.
Hi, when we were there in the Galapagos,
Oh,
they said, oh, we're not returning tomorrow because the airport has been taken over by the army, which, you know, does raise your eyebrows.
yeah. Yes. Yes, Ecuador owns is the Galapagos Islands, right? Question.
Well, yes, we have a Zoom comment. I think this must be a cousin, great job, cousin, from Barry.
Oh, from Barry in Nova Scotia.
And Barry's asking, Valerie, what do you remember most about the people you encountered on this amazing journey?
Yeah, most of the people that we encountered in our famous buses in particular were very poor people, but were so kind and thoughtful and friendly. Yes, they were lovely people, but you could tell by their dress in particular that they had very little money at all. And the bus, these great buses that I've talked about, were the cheapest way they could get from one place to the other.
Okay. Another question is, how were you affected by the height that you were, the elevation?
I did well, but one of the other teachers in our group, when we were in Potosí, where the Silver Mountain is, and it's at 13,000 feet, she wasn't coping and had to go to bed. And in the hotels and in many places, they give you coca tea, so to revive you. And I do remember we were up on the next floor, or I can't remember how many. I do remember finding it very hard to walk up the stairs in the hotel to our room.
Right.
Yes.
Last question that I have that, unless there are others from the auditorium after, in general, did you feel safe then? In other words, from the standpoint of your health, being able to eat the food and drink the water, and also in your well-being in the different places that you were outside of Ecuador, maybe. Well, how did you feel? Comfortable?
Yes. Oh, very comfortable. I look back and maybe we were very foolish about what we ate. And I didn't talk about that. One of the things that we loved were fruit juices. They have so many fruits that you don't see here at all. And they make juice out of all of them. And they were delicious. And you just buy them on the street. So we bought them on the street. And now I look back and I think, I'm not sure how great that was, but I'm still alive to tell the tale. And we had a lot of good food.
Very, very good. We'll turn it back to the auditorium and see if we have any other questions from Arnie.
Mm-hmm.
Brazil is larger than the contiguous United States. It doesn't look like that because the usual map projection that we have is northern hemisphere centric. And so South America looks much smaller than it is. The same thing with Australia, looks much smaller
Right.
than in fact it
Yes,
is.
Yes, Brazil is huge, absolutely huge. Yes.
Yeah, just to go along with that, I think Peru is 3 times the size of Texas. Just this little country of Peru, little quote, is 3 times the size of Texas. But the question is, do you speak Spanish?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
nice.
Oh, and I should add, since you asked me that question, because I'd thought of saying at the beginning of the talk, I was here last year to talk about crossing from West Africa over to East Africa and Cairo. And I was teaching there with voluntary service overseas, which is the British equivalent of the Peace Corps. When I went for my interview and they said, do you have a preference where you would like to go? I said, I'd like to go to a Spanish speaking country because I know a lot of Spanish. So they sent me to Ghana, where there are something like 100 local languages and English is the official language. So I decided, well, I didn't get sent there. I'm going to have to find my way to some Spanish-speaking country. So that's how I wound up in Argentina.
You mentioned Peace Corps, which I served in Peru in 1968. And I wonder if you recall in November of 1968, there was a total eclipse of the sun over Lake Titicaca.
No,
Which I experienced. I didn't know if anybody
Really?
else was there.
Really?
Yes.
No, I do not remember that. That must have been wonderful because that Titicaca and around there is a special place. Oh, this one.
Oh, there he is. My wife and I, we were in Argentina and Colombia and a few other countries. We were on a 3-week cruise and we took a tour in Buenos Aires.
Mhm.
And the most interesting thing at that time was this, our guide showed us their stadium where they played soccer.
Oh,
And of course, you know, they're fervent soccer fans,
yes.
football. And he said that they put up an advertisement of Coca-Cola in the stadium. And Coca-Cola's colors with their advertising is usually red and black. But in that stadium, the team's colors were yellow and blue.
Yes.
And Coca-Cola's advertisement there was yellow and blue. And it's one of the only places in the world that they have allowed
Right.
something like
Right.
that. Then another thing, we were in one of the busiest areas in Buenos Aires, and somebody said the major thoroughfare. It was something like the 4th of July street.
It's the 5th of July.
There you go.
Cinco
Okay.
de Julio.
Okay. So they said the 5th of July Boulevard. That is the widest boulevard in the world
It is. Yes.
until you've been to Vegas.
Oh,
Because I think between 2 of the hotels, they built a bridge in Vegas because the street is so wide and so busy that they have,
yes.
you know, a bridge over there, you know, but
Cinco
it was,
de Julio.
pardon? Yes.
Cinco de Julio is the date when Argentina got its independence from Spain.
Yeah.
So it's a big, big deal there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that was one of my observations.
I think we can turn this over to Bob and to Dick to close our meeting. But it was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.